joining us in this evening's presentation as we look at the subject of Jesus. Is it historical or mythical? We want to thank our presenter, Robert Chisholm, who is going to present information for each and every one of us. So pray God's blessing upon each and every one of you. Do have your questions ready for when the question and answer starts. You know, as the times pass, and let me say again, not all of you on social media, you're joining us via the Zoom or Facebook or YouTube. Welcome everyone. You know, for a long time there, up to today, there's still people who doubt or don't outright reject the historicity of Jesus. And many persons even seek to claim that the Jesus of the Bible was born from ancient pagan ideas and sources out of Egypt, and whether it be Horus or Zeus of Greece and so on. Is there evidence, good evidence, that Jesus really existed? Well, Clinton Chisholm will present such evidence for us this evening. And in case you are joining us for the first time and you don't know who Clinton Chisholm is, just let me give you a brief bio of him. Reverend Chisholm studied at Jamaica Theological Seminary, the Jamaica School of Music, the University of the West Indies, Sheffield University, England, and the International Academy of Politics, Humanism, and Human Rights in France. In 2005, he was awarded the Honorary Doctor of Divinity in Greek by the Caribbean Graduate School of Theology in Jamaica, where he served as a guest lecturer. The Reverend Mr. Chisholm has been involved in education at home in Jamaica and abroad, having served as my school teacher, lecturer at Jamaica Theological Seminary, guest lecturer at the Caribbean Graduate School of Theology, Jamaica, tutor in philosophy at the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica, tutor in business ethics at the University of Technology, Jamaica, teaching assistant in Hebrew at Sheffield University, England. He has produced 25 educational audio video, several hot topics such as homosexuality, clinical and biblical perspectives, Afrocentrism, and Black consciousness, challenges for Christianity, and the church's impact on Western civilization. He has written 5 books: A Matter of Principle, Revelation, and Rastafari, Youth Discipleship, A Controversial Clergyman, and recently released Rastafari Beliefs, A Critical Analysis. You can get much more about Clinton Chisholm on his website, The Clinton Source, so feel free to look up Reverend Chisholm online at the Chisholm Source. Yes, got it right, Chisholm Source. Okay, so at this time we will turn over to Clinton, who will address us on this topic, Jesus, historical or mythical. And after the lecture, we will come back to you for your questions and he will answer them for you. Thank you very much.
My time, Rog?
Yeah, go ahead, Clinton.
Bless you, my friend. Let me start with an apology, which I've been trained not to do, but I can't help it. My eyes have worsened. My right eye, the only one working, has worsened because of glaucoma. I can just barely fight to read script. So I covet your prayers, and I'm going to read very stodgily, not as smoothly as I would like, because I'm watching the screen where I have my script. You will get the notes from Project Probe if you're interested in it, so you can follow in your own time. But bear with me, I'm not going to be as smooth as I normally would be or would like to be. So bear with me, please. So, here goes. Jesus, historical or mythical? There are several persons, genuine scholars and some pretenders, who doubt that Jesus of Nazareth really existed in the first century of our era. Indeed, Some even go further and argue that Jesus did not exist at all. Most of all such persons reject the documents of the New Testament, NT for short, as reliable evidentiary material about Jesus. I isolate for specific mention Dr. Ray Higgins, who has a following on YouTube, who sustains the belief that Jesus never existed and that the documents of the New Testament are too late to be regarded as helpful in proving anything about Jesus as a historical existent. I am amazed that Dr. Higgins and his kind are taken seriously by anyone who can read well and reason logically. Why do I say this? Set aside the documents of the New Testament and comb the available literature, and you find non-Christian writers mentioning Jesus as having been crucified under the Roman official Pontius Pilate. How can you crucify a mythical individual? Seriously, can you? For me, I could stop my presentation there as an irrefutable point. It is just absolute nonsense to claim that Jesus was mythical if you concede that he was crucified based on the evidence from Roman officials who had carried no brief for Christianity at all. Tacitus says Jesus was in fact crucified. Tacitus, AD 55 to 120, a Roman historian of high rank, in his Annals 15.44, written approximately 85, while dealing with the fire of Rome, which was about AD 64. He says, quote, consequent, come on, what's happening here now? To get rid of the report, Nero report that he was the cause of fire. Nero has fastened the guilt, indicted most, and inflicted exquisite a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, end quote. The Jewish historian, non-Christian by the way, Josephus, AD 3738 to 97, became court historian for Emperor Vespasian. He prophesied that Vespasian would be emperor after the war between the Romans and the Jews, AD 66 through to 70 or 73, 75. In his annals, in his antiquities, approximately AD 90 to 95, he said of Jesus, quote, he was the Christ. Some claim that that may have been modified by Christians. Well, let's just say he was believed to be the Christ. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to believe, to love him, did not give up their affection for him, end quote. Modern agnostic and specialist historian on Christian origins, Bart Mann says, quote, up to this stage, a quest to see the historical Jesus actually existed, I have been mounting the positive argument, showing why the evidence is overwhelming that Jesus really did live as a Jewish teacher in Palestine and was crucified at the direction of the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, end quote. In Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist? 2012 at page 177. Apart from the modern Ehrman, Tacitus and Josephus mention Jesus' crucifixion within a century of his death. The Gospels do likewise, much less than a century. But Paul, in 1 Corinthians 15, based on the creedal nature of his language, that is verses 3 to 5, is agreed by fairly wide consensus of New Testament scholars to have passed on a tradition which goes back to within a decade of Jesus' death. Early material indeed. Let's look at a test case of historicity, that of the larger-than-life military genius Alexander the Great. He died in 323 BC. The details of his existence and exploits are best derived from the writings about him by Greek historians Arrian, AD 86, 89, and Plutarch, AD 46. Some 400 years later than Alexander's death. Did Alexander really exist? Historians trust the studies of Arrian and Plutarch, despite the centuries gap in Alexander's death and their records of him. We come now to the textual integrity of the New Testament. The New Testament is superior to all other ancient books in terms of number and caliber of manuscripts. That's what MSS means. MS manuscript singular, MSS manuscripts plural. Date of contents vis-a-vis date of writing plus date of earliest copies. Let me provide some summary comparative statistics concerning the New Testament. There are approximately 25,000 manuscripts and portions of the New Testament available to textual critics, the people who usually have thick glasses and dark eyes or not so bright eyes, who examine literature to test whether the material on which the literature is written is good enough to serve as reliable evidence for whatever is purported in those documents. In the entire body of ancient Greek and Latin literature, the closest rival is Homer's Iliad, with 643 scripts. The history of Thucydides is available from 8 manuscripts. Aristotle's Poetics, 5 manuscripts, and Caesar's Gallic Wars, 10 manuscripts. Incidentally, if all of the approximately 25,000 manuscripts and portions of the New Testament were destroyed, we could reconstruct all but 11 verses of the New Testament from the approximately 89,000 quotations of the New Testament in the writings of the 2nd century church fathers. The time lapse from event to writing in the New Testament is the shortest of all ancient documents, except for 3 writers, Pliny the Younger, a Roman judicial official, and the historians Herodotus and Thucydides, who were writing while the events were happening or a few years after they happened. But the gap between writing and the earliest manuscript for the New Testament is the shortest, bar no other ancient document. None even compares, quite frankly. In contrast to the traditional centuries gap between writing and earliest manuscripts for classical texts, papyrologist Young Q Kim cogently argued that Papyrus P46, containing Paul's letters, should no longer be dated at AD 200, but a full century earlier. You will see the reference for your double checking when you get my script. Another papyrologist, Carsten Tiede, and by the way, the TH in German is silent. It's just like, sorry, not silent, just pronounced as a T, not as a TH. Tiede argued, based on scraps of parchment in Magdalene, and that Magdalen, it looks like Magdalene, it's pronounced Magdalene College at Oxford University, containing fragments from Matthew's Gospel, that the Gospel can be dated to the 1st century. References there for your double checking as well. See also Eyewitness to Jesus, a book I highly recommend for your library if you're a serious student of Christian history and things related to Christian history. 1996 by Tiede and Matthew D'Ancona. Understandably, these are radical views, but cogently argued, very cogently argued. And the controversies they have triggered are still raging within academia, the universities of the world. Beyond the technical dating cues from papyrologists, I join others in offering a simple, irrefutable dating cue about the New Testament documents. Our Lord's uncanny prophecy, AD 30, concerning the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple was fulfilled in AD 70. Yet, no New Testament document mentioned the fulfillment, suggesting very strongly, clearly, that every New Testament book was written before the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And let me just add, including the late-dated, usually late-dated book of Revelation. Every single one of them, all written before the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. What all this textual integrity material means is this. If you doubt or dismiss the Bible's, the New Testament's reliability, then you wipe out the reliability of almost all classical literature and beyond. The New Testament is reliable and trustworthy as documents, and they provide the earliest and fullest material on the historical Jesus, and each document stands on its own as a separate piece of evidence. Critics usually do the unfair thing of relegating all of the New Testament documents as just one piece of evidence because they come under the umbrella New Testament. Each book in there is a separate piece of evidence, can be adduced in a court of law and accepted as such. Jesus did exist, and we have better supporting documentation of that than for Alexander the Great, and might I add even some of the emperors of Rome, and indeed for our own Jamaican national heroine, the only female in our list of heroes, Nanny of the Maroons. Ponder now the words of my former philosophy lecturer at Biola University, Professor William Lane Craig, in a recorded lecture in Jamaica years ago. The full lecture, The Evidence for Jesus, is available from my web store, thechisholmsource.com. I'm going to ask the brethren now to play track 1 from that MP3 download. And then we open for your questions. The audio of track 1, please. This was a series of lectures he did in Jamaica years ago. I had them recorded for my website. He's there with the historicity of the resurrection, and I've forgotten the other one that's on my website. William Lane Craig, one of the leading apologists in the world today. Even while Ravi was alive, he exceeded Ravi in terms of content and knowledge.
And we saw that the New Testament documents are the most important historical sources for Jesus of Nazareth. The so-called apocryphal Gospels are forgeries, which came much later and are for the most part elaborations of the 4 New Testament Gospels. This doesn't mean that there aren't sources outside the Bible which refer to Jesus. There are. He's referred to in pagan, Jewish, and Christian writings outside the New Testament. The Jewish historian Josephus is especially interesting. In the pages of his works, you can read about New Testament people like the high priests Annas and Caiaphas, the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, King Herod, John the Baptist, even Jesus himself and his brother James. There have also been interesting archaeological discoveries as well bearing on the Gospels. For example, in 1961, the first archaeological evidence concerning Pilate was unearthed in the town of Caesarea. It was an inscription of a dedication bearing Pilate's name and title. Even more recently, in 1990, the actual tomb of Caiaphas, the high priest who presided over Jesus' trial, was discovered south of Jerusalem. In fact, the tomb beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem is, in all probability, the tomb in which Jesus himself was laid by Joseph of Arimathea following the crucifixion. According to Luke Johnson, a New Testament scholar at Emory University, even the most critical historian can confidently assert that a Jew named Jesus worked as a teacher and wonder worker in Palestine during the reign of Tiberius, was executed by crucifixion under the prefect Pontius Pilate, and continued to have followers after his death.
So we open now for your questions.
Okay, if you have a question, feel free to either type it in the chat or raise your hand. We will acknowledge you and let Quinton answer your question.
Anybody, anywhere.
Quinton, I may ask a question. What would you say to those who claim that the whole, Jesus was stolen from pre-pagan sources like Horus of Egypt, the god Horus of Egypt, or Zeus of Greece? What would you say to those who claim such?
People need to read ancient literature carefully. They're appealing to mythical entities, not really historical figures at all. And it's too popular in the university circles. Lecturers who are proud of their record intellectually should preserve their record by knocking these nonsense arguments to pieces. They're not worth the mouths that they come from nor the paper on which they are written. Okay. And no Jew who is arrogantly Jewish would appeal to a pagan source for anything at all. The Old Testament is replete with injunctions against mixing even with people whose morality is suspect or definitely not according to what the fussy God of the Bible would require. So they would have to, what motive would they have for appealing to legends generally, or to myths or material from a pagan source? Of course, when they were in a backsliding condition, they did as much, but nobody would hold that up as favored by the prophets of the Old Testament.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have a question?
And they're thinking they can about 500 dying and rising saviors or gods in the world. It's just absolute. I cannot kind of. It's just absolute nonsense. They are appealing to mythical entities or the configuration of stories in some ancient literature reflecting winter, death, and spring life. There is no historical entity that has died as a god or as a savior and was risen from the dead. Absolutely none. I put my credentials as a serious intellectual on the line by saying that nobody can rebut or refute that statement. None of the so-called dying, rising saviors are historical. They're reflections of the agricultural cycle, winter, death, spring, life.
Okay, so Jesus existed as a real person, but what about his features? We know we have the Eurocentric view, and then now there are many who are claiming that Jesus was Negroid, a black man. How, where does the historical Jesus fall into this in terms of what he may have looked like?
In terms of physical features, we don't have much solid evidence to go on. Speculations abound. And I maintain, I've said it in my first book, A Matter of Principle, that I don't see why any church or any Christian would need one of those depictions or so-called speculations about what Jesus looked like. White, long-haired. He was, in the Middle East, he very likely would be brown-skinned at worst. But we have no solid evidence that he was Negroid. But he was, as the savior of the world. And if people want to depict him based on their ethnicity, then they're entitled to that. But I say if you have to hang up any of these pictures, put a huge sign that even my close to blind eyes could see and have it said, this is an artistic impression, not a photograph. So nobody is misled. In the early days in Sunday school literature, early years I should say, way back, and maybe still in some areas, people are seeing only white people as entities in their Sunday school literature or other pieces of Christian literature. Very unfortunate, but now the tide has changed dramatically, and the people who are writing Sunday school quarterlies now are depicting black people in the Caribbean region or non-white people in the Caribbean region as the entities that the average youngster would encounter in their Sunday school or Sabbath school lesson. That's taken us too long to reach there, but at least we are reaching there.
Thank you. Anyone with a question for Reverend Chisholm, please?
Good evening, everyone. Hope I'm being heard.
Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, I made this point already, but I think it is worthwhile being made. The Roman Empire would have been extremely glad to expose Jesus of Nazareth as a hoax. I have said that the easiest thing for them to do was to bring the might of the Roman Empire into Jerusalem, locate the body of Jesus, and hang it up to show people that Jesus is in fact dead. The fact that they were unable to do that should say something to us as people, that no one was ever able to show the body of Jesus. Yet, as Paul says, many people saw him after he rose. And even Josephus, the historian, is reported to have spoken about this Jesus who was raised after 3 days.
And it's fascinating, that people don't stop to think about these things that should be staring them in the face. The idea that Jesus was not resurrected, even if you grant his existence and maybe his crucifixion, and his death, that he was not resurrected, why didn't somebody produce the evidence of his body in Jerusalem, where it all happened, and in Jerusalem, where he was buried in a private tomb? The wrong tomb theory runs into shipwreck because Jesus was not buried in a public cemetery. It's a private tomb owned by a rich man. The body was missing. I saw a movie titled The Body donkeys years ago. I've mentioned it in different settings and nobody else has seen it. Myself and that theologian from JTS, Dr. Palmer, I inveigled him, I have to say, on that sacred Good Friday day in Jamaican tradition, to go to the movies with me and let us watch it and analyze it. The thesis of The Body, the movie The Body, the star was Antonio Banderas. The thesis was that they did not so much go to the wrong tomb, they went to the wrong section of the right tomb. Give me a break. So they would have a loculus where you would deposit bones after a while. And they say, well, they were in the right tomb, but the wrong area, and therefore they missed the loculus that would have contained his remains. It's a bogus thesis, but movies are used to attract people's mind and confuse people's minds. So we have to read everything and watch carefully with an analytical mind. And I'm fussy about that, and I'm a maker in the country and elsewhere, because I ask the hard questions and dig the research deeper to provide the contrary evidence against what people are trying to advance against Christianity and the Bible. None of the theories work anymore. In fact, the people who advanced them early, their modern descendants abandoned them. Hallucination theory. Nobody saw Jesus post-mortem. Paul says over 500 people saw him at once, and most of them were still alive at the time when he was writing 1 Corinthians, roughly AD 37, 42. The swoon theory that he didn't really die, he fainted on the cross, shipwreck against. You couldn't bring that in any modern court of law and not be laughed out of court. The most idiotic one, a guy who got a PhD from an American university, was debated by William Lane Craig, the twin brother theory. Jesus had a hitherto unknown twin brother who reappeared conveniently after Jesus' death and passed off himself as the resurrected Christ. Did anybody else know that Mary had twins when she was pregnant? It's just crazy. This is what people do when they're desperate to a material that they cannot otherwise try to refute.
Thank you. Is there anyone else with a question? Don't go away with it. Feel free to ask.
I think something is in the chat.
No, okay, that's if you need the notes from today's lecture, you can email us at projectproadmin@gmail.com, and you can get copies of the notes from this evening's lecture. So no one else has a question that is burning you?
I hope the presentation was not clear as mud. But you have my notes, so you can go over it, and you feel free to take me on privately. Take Roger for my email address. I cannot read script easily now, but I'll try by my magnifying glass or ask a friend to read for me, and I'll try to respond to whatever follow-up you have, having gone through the notes yourself, which I highly recommend. I don't want you to take it because Chisholm has said so. Chisholm can blunder. I'm not the fourth member of the Trinity. So I'm prone to make mistakes like anybody else. Check me out, analyze what I've said, what I've written, and then get back to me if you have a query, a concern, a refutation that I maybe have never encountered before. You never can tell.
Clinton, I came across recently an atheist who rejects Jesus' historicity.
Mm-hmm.
And he was saying that when we refer to historians like Tacitus and so on, that they are quoting other sources, and therefore they are not reliable in what they would have written. What would you say to that?
Well, the onus is on whoever is propounding. I would like that atheist to present me one shred of evidence that Tacitus was not drawing on his own knowledge as a reputable historian in the Roman hierarchy. So Suetonius also mentions Jesus. Were they both drawing on material? What material? The onus is on that atheist to produce the material. I don't know of any. They were drawing on their own knowledge in their own time, or reputable sources within the Roman collection of literature. But even if they're drawing on other people, were the other people wrong? Did the other people invent Jesus, invent his crucifixion, invent his death, invent his resurrection?
Thank you. So I guess we have no other questions. Everything is very clear to everyone.
I trust so. And friends, I would
Or you can
recommend,
make a comment if you don't have a question. Feel free to share a comment as well.
I recommend the brethren to check my website, the Chisholm Source. Go to the store and you'll see about 27 MP3 downloads on different topics, including the ones I mentioned earlier by William Lane Craig, my former philosophy professor at Biola University. The historicity of the resurrection, the evidence for Jesus, and there's one other which has escaped my old brain. But there are several other titles. Reading the Bible Meaningfully, Introduction to the Bible, Divorce and Remarriage, Second Thoughts. Several other titles are there. Check out my website, the Chisholm Source, and the store. And you'll find articles that I've submitted to the Jamaican press and elsewhere, also on my website.
Okay, thank you. All right. It seems that we have exhausted what could be said. We're most likely preaching to the converted here today.
All right.
There are no persons in this discussion who have any doubts about Jesus' existence, and that's good.
And I usually say, and I upsetted one of my precious sisters when I was in Jamaica. My home church was the Gregory Park Baptist Church. I told her, I like this song, He Lives, but I am not pleased with the content of the section that says, you ask me how I know He lives within my heart. Big deal. How do you distinguish Jesus living in your heart as opposed to indigestion? We need much more about Jesus' existence, and much more is available. I would highly recommend as well, Roger, The Case for Christ, updated and enlarged by Lee Strobel. And there is a young people's version, so the younger ones in our churches should benefit from it. They must not be deprived of the material because they are too young. There's a youth version of the book. Very valuable. There are others more technical, like Eyewitnesses of Jesus by Dan Kona and Tila, whom I mentioned in the lecture. Tons of stuff available. And Bart Ehrman, who is a self-style agnostic, did Jesus really exist?
Good evening, Dr. Chisholm. Samuel Lane here from Barbados. Could you please repeat your website address again, please?
The Chisholm, www.thechisholm, CHISHOLM, source.com.
Oh, source. Okay.
Source.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
SOURCE, right.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Bless you, my brother.
Good evening, Dr. Chisholm.
Good evening, sis.
Right. I just want to thank you for your presentation. I always enjoy your presentations. I just want to make a comment. I probably into a question as well. Have you ever heard of a Nazareth inscription?
The Nazareth Decree, it's called.
Okay. All right.
It's called in 1868 in Nazareth. Presumed to have been written by Claudius. Claudius was on the imperial throne 41 to 54. And it had to do with his decree that nobody should mess with graves. I think that came about as a result of the fact that the tomb was found empty. So he says, if anybody messes with the graves or breaks the seals around graves, the person should experience capital punishment upon conviction. In fact, what I'll do, I'll send...
this inscription...
Go ahead, sis.
So this inscription was not made before Jesus died. It was made after he died.
Right. It was made after he died. I think in light of the rumors going about, which Suetonius and Tacitus call mischievous superstitions, because they probably didn't believe in resurrection. Period. Just like intellectual city of Corinth, even Christians in that church did not believe in resurrection. Dead people stay dead. Argument done. And Paul had to argue with them logically. If that is so, the heart of your gospel has been ransacked. So you have to recognize that even though it does normally happen, it happened on this occasion. Jesus was raised from the dead. And that's why we can claim forgiveness of sins and hope for the hereafter. Death does not end it all.
Thank you.
And Roger, please remind the old brain. I have 12 historical facts concerning the resurrection drawn from Gary Habermas's book on the ancient evidence for the life of Christ. And it mentions the Nazareth decree, found in Nazareth 1868. So I'll send that with my script from this evening.
Okay, that leads us to our next presentation, because this is the first in a three-part series. The next one will be on the 29th of this month, the same time, on the same platform. And we'll be looking at Jesus, was his resurrection a hoax? So you can get more information on the facts behind the resurrection of Christ in our next presentation with Clinton on the 29th. So earmark that and plan to be here in this format on Zoom, YouTube, and Facebook for that presentation. Jesus, was his resurrection a hoax?
And please invite your friends, neighbors, not people who are not even your friends. Just invite anybody. If you want to hear an intellectual presentation in defense of the resurrection, the reality of the resurrection of Jesus, come and listen to the lecture on the 29th.
Yeah,
and invite critics as well. We are open to all.
Correct. And particularly invite people who are unsaved, who are unconverted, who have doubts, who have questions, who are antagonistic even, atheists even. So invite them to the next session, because their burning questions there can be answered. Okay, so we want to thank you for coming this evening. A short presentation with a lot of information still. And if you want to get those notes, feel free to email us again at projectproadmin@gmail.com. You can also visit Reverend Clinton's website, the Chisholm Source, and get lots more information as well on these and other pertinent topics. Okay, unless are there any other burning questions, or we will bring our session to a close at this time. No more questions, no more comments.
Dr. Chisholm, Samuel Lane here again from Barbados. Haven't seen you in Barbados for a long time. Have you abandoned
somebody
us?
needs to invite me back home.
Yeah, I've seen you at Abundant Life Assembly years ago, many years ago.
Years ago, that's right.
Oh, yes. Good to see you, though.
Revisit.
God bless.
Bless you, my brother.
Okay, thank you once again for coming, everyone.
Hey, Roger.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is Jeff. Yeah, I just wanted to ask just a little more information on what Dr. Chisholm referred to as the apocryphal gospels.
Well, William Lane Craig. These are gospels that came out the earliest must be late 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, trying to fill in the gap between Jesus's public ministry at the end and from his infancy at 12 in the temple. They're trying to fill in the gap. What happened during those so-called hidden years?
Can you name some of them?
You have the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of almost anybody who was of repute in the 1st century. People just came up with these apocryphal Gospels, claiming that their source was one of the member of Jesus' disciples band or apostolic band. And some of them you can actually find online if you search hard and read for yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Good.
Okay. All right, so God bless you. Thank you for coming. We pray God's peace upon you and blessings as you retire for tonight in preparation for service tomorrow. Wherever you worship, let's do so in spirit and in truth. So God bless you. Thank you for coming this evening. Trust you have received lots to help you forward in your faith, to contend for the truth of the gospel. And again, be reminded, our next presentation will be on the 29th of this month at 6 p.m. again on Facebook, YouTube, and Zoom. And we'll be looking at Jesus, was his resurrection a hoax? So we look forward to seeing you then, and do invite a friend.
Will that be a Saturday?
That's a Saturday as well, yes.
Thanks.
Okay. So God bless you. Have a pleasant night in the name of the Lord. Good night.
You.
Thank you, my brother.
Thank you very much. Same to you.
You too. Thank you. All right.